The movie begins by showing the city of Seoul as a blur of neon lights and traffic as the sun began to set, casting a fiery orange glow across the skyline. In a dark alleyway, a legendary assassin known as the Goblin received orders from his boss to eliminate a group of dangerous gangsters. He was accompanied by his fellow assassin, Young Min, who was still an amateur in the field. Together, they set out to complete the mission, utilizing their unique set of skills and strategies. The Goblin's reputation preceded him as they stealthily took out each gangster one by one. However, during the mission, a momentary lapse of judgment on Young Min's part resulted in his suffering severe injuries. The Goblin, whose real name was Do Hyun, wasted no time and rushed Young Min to the hospital for treatment. Soon after the assassination, the case was taken over by the police. They were able to catch the client who had hired a hitman named Kim for the job, a wealthy businessman who was quickly arrested. However, the police were unable to track down the organization that Kim had hired to carry out the murder. During their investigation, the police identified two suspects based on evidence at the scene. One was believed to be a seasoned professional hitman, while the others were presumed to be amateurs. The police suspected that the legendary assassin known as the Goblin was the professional hitman in question, due to the precision and skill displayed during the duel fight. If their hunch was correct, the police were prepared to go to great lengths to track down the organization that sheltered the Goblin, in order to prevent any further wrongful arrests. To gather intelligence, they even sent an undercover officer to infiltrate the organization. Turning to Do Hyun or Goblin, who just finished treating Young Min's wounds, Young Min started to wake up from his fainting. Do Hyun told him that during the time he was unconscious, his phone had received many calls. Young Min then checked his phone and was shocked to discover that his daughter had been taken to the hospital for a heart attack. He rushed to the hospital to check on his daughter's condition. Once there, Young Min can only take his daughter to the front of the ICU room. After successfully passing through her critical period, Young Min is finally able to visit his daughter. However, his relief is short-lived as he realizes that the cost of her care is not cheap. This adds to Young Min's worries, but he receives a text from the assassin organization he works for, calling all assassins to gather at the base. Upon arrival, Young Min is horrified to see another fellow assassin being tortured by their boss, Bak-sun. The reason for the torture is that the fellow assassin's identity as a police spy has been revealed. Bak-sun calls the last call list on the spy's cell phone and confirms that the person who picked it up is a detective named Choi. With this revelation, Bak-sun orders Young Min to finish off the spy. However, Young Min is still an amateur and looks nervous. Just as he is about to carry out the order, Do Hyun arrives and immediately executes the spy without mercy. The scene now shifts to Detective Choi, who receives the distressing news that his undercover agent was killed during his assignment. Without wasting any time, he and his team rush to the agent's residence to search for any clues that may lead them to the killer. During their search, Detective Choi notices a small note on the calendar, which records the location of the headquarters of a notorious hit organization. The note indicates that the organization is located in a factory building called Sungmi. Back to Young Min, who is in a desperate situation. His daughter's hospital bills are piling up, and he needs to find a way to pay them off quickly. As a member of a criminal organization, he turns to his boss, Bak-sun, for a new mission that will earn him the money he needs. Bak-sun obliges and assigns Young Min to take out an official within their own organization, who happens to be Goblin's mentor. Despite the high stakes and the dangerous nature of the task, the promised rewards are too great for Young Min to resist. With his daughter's health on the line, he quickly sets off to Target's apartment complex. As he pulls into the parking lot, Young Min's nerves begin to get the better of him. He knows that facing Goblin's mentor, a martial arts master, will not be an easy feat. However, the thought of his daughter's mounting medical bills forces him to push his fears aside and carry out the mission. Meanwhile, Goblin takes a break from his criminal activities to visit his daughter, Yena. As he arrives at his ex-wife Ji-young's house, he notices that she is pretending to be asleep and doesn't welcome him. Do Hyun is reminded of a message that Ji-young had sent him in the past, warning him to leave the criminal underworld. She didn't want their daughter to grow up and find out that her father was a hitman. Reflecting on his wife's words, Do Hyun enters the house and begins to spend time with his daughter. He can't help but feel the weight of his wife's concerns and worries about his chosen profession. Back to Young Min, who has arrived at the apartment complex of Goblin's teacher, Hae-kong. Despite the martial arts master's formidable reputation, Young Min is armed with a knife and determined to defeat him. The two engage in a fierce duel, and it becomes apparent to Hae-kong that Young Min is not to be underestimated. Young Min fights with all his might, driven by his desperation to earn the money he needs to pay for his daughter's hospital bills. Although he comes dangerously close to losing his life, he ultimately emerges victorious over Hae-kong. Despite his triumph, the intensity of the battle has left him covered in blood. After the duel, Young Min takes a moment to compose himself and cleanse the blood from his body. Following his successful mission against Hae-kong, Young Min meets with Bak-sun to hand over the knife and collect his paycheck. However, to his shock and dismay, Bak-sun reneges on their initial agreement and refuses to pay him the promised amount. Feeling betrayed and deceived, Young Min's emotions boil over, and he impulsively attacks and kills Bak Son. After taking out his former boss, Young Min is left to grapple with the consequences of his actions. After Young Min leaves, Do Hyun arrives at Bak Son's room and discovers him dead from a knife wound. In his final moments, Bak Son reveals to Do Hyun that his killer was Young Min, not him. Before Do Hyun could even process the shocking news, Detective Choi and his team suddenly storm the building and catch him at the scene of the crime. Detective Choi is taken aback by the sight of Bak Son's lifeless body, and he immediately assumes that Do Hyun is responsible for the hitman's death. With little evidence to prove his innocence, Do Hyun is arrested and taken into custody for questioning. A year passes, and Ji-young finally loses her patience. She sends a final letter to Do Hyun, warning him never to try to contact her or their daughter Ye-na after his release from prison. In the letter, Ji-young explains that she has already decided to tell Ye-na that her father is dead and asks him to respect her wishes. Meanwhile, Young Min comes to visit Do Hyun in prison to apologize for his wrongful accusation. However, Do Hyun is in no mood to see anyone and rejects the visit, consumed with grief and regret over his past actions. A few days after his visit to Do Hyun in prison, Young Min uses the money he obtained from his mission to form his own gang. He sets out to establish his dominance in the criminal underworld and soon becomes one of the city's most feared and notorious crime bosses, running his own assassin organization. As Young Min's power and influence grow, he becomes a wanted man, pursued by the police and feared by his enemies. After serving his prison term, Do Hyun was finally released after 8 years. At the same time, in a Seoul elementary school, a girl named Eun-ju had become a bully and was picking on her classmates. When Ye-na, Do Hyun's daughter who attended the same school, saw Eun-ju bullying her friend, she stepped in to defend them, and the two girls nearly got into a fight. Fortunately, their homeroom teacher was there to intervene and stop the conflict. That night at his house, Young Min, who is now a successful boss of an assassin organization, seems to be enjoying his lavish lifestyle with his abundant wealth. He returns home to have dinner with his daughter Eun-ju, who appears indifferent towards him. Despite Young Min's intentions to take Eun-ju on a vacation abroad, she refuses and leaves. Meanwhile, Do Hyun, who has been released from prison after serving his sentence, finds a job as a car washer. The work environment is friendly, and Do Hyun's boss is kind to him. However, after work, Do Hyun still thinks about his wife and daughter and plans to find them. The next day, Do Hyun made a difficult decision to reach out to Detective Choi, the same police officer who had once incarcerated him. He hoped that the detective could help him locate his missing wife and daughter. When he arrived at the police station, Do Hyun met with Detective Choi, who expressed a willingness to assist him on one condition, that Do Hyun provides information about his former partner in crime, Young Min. Do Hyun was faced with a dilemma. He needed the detective's help, but he doesn't want to turn his back on the criminal world. Do Hyun refused to cooperate and promptly left the station. Later that evening, Do Hyun's new boss, Heo-kan, invited all of his employees to celebrate at a local tavern. However, after drinking excessively, Heo-kan became uncontrollable and started assaulting Do Hyun. The police were called, and both men were taken into custody. The news of the incident quickly reached Detective Choi, who immediately assumed that Do Hyun was the perpetrator. When he arrived at the police station, he was shocked to see Do Hyun badly beaten and learned that he was the victim of the attack, not the aggressor. As the truth came to light, Heo-kan took responsibility for his actions and apologized to Do Hyun. The two men decided to handle the matter privately, settling their dispute in a more amicable and respectful manner. Detective Choi observed the incident and realized that the time Do Hyun spent in prison had transformed him into a better person. He was moved by the change he saw in Do Hyun and decided to help him reunite with his family. The next day, Detective Choi visited Do Hyun and gave him the address of Ji-young's salon. Grateful for the help, Do Hyun rushed to the salon after work to see his wife and daughter. As he arrived, Do Hyun saw Ji-young from a distance and felt overwhelmed with emotions. He couldn't bring himself to approach her directly, so he chose to observe his family from afar. Suddenly, Ye-na, who did not recognize him as her father, appeared behind him and reprimanded him for watching her mother's salon from a distance. As Do Hyun stands there, he realizes that the girl in front of him is actually Ye-na, his daughter. However, he doesn't reveal his identity and quickly retreats to his car without saying a word. While watching his daughter, he sees her being run over by a man on the street, causing her cell phone to fall and get dirty. Ye-na demands that the man apologize, but he gets angry and almost hits her. Do Hyun quickly intervenes, stopping the man before he can do any harm. Just as he's about to take matters into his own hands and beat up the man, Ji-young, Ye-na's mother, walks out of the salon and separates them. Ji-young is surprised to see Do Hyun, who she thought was still in prison, and explains to Ye-na that he is an old friend. Ye-na thanks Do Hyun for coming to her aid, not realizing yet that he is her father. After the intense encounter on the street, Do Hyun, Ji-young, and Ye-na decided to have dinner together at a food store. The mood was tense at first, but Ye-na broke the ice by cracking a joke about Do Hyun's feelings toward her mother. However, Ji-young didn't take it well and excused herself to the restroom. As they waited for Ji-young's return, Ye-na and Do Hyun began to bond over their shared interests, and Ye-na even took a selfie with Do Hyun as a memento of their meeting. She gave him her phone number and offered to help him get closer to her mother. After returning home from dinner, Do Hyun spends some time cleaning up and getting ready for bed. He takes a moment to look at the selfie he took with Ye-na, feeling happy to have finally met his daughter. As he settles into bed, he receives a call from Ji-young, who requests that he meet her at a cafe. At the cafe, Ji-young shares with Do Hyun the story of her life while he was in prison. She and Ye-na had traveled to the United States, where Ji-young had a relationship with a white man that ended not long ago. After returning to South Korea, they opened a beauty salon together. Ji-young mentions how happy Ye-na was when she met someone new and warns Do Hyun not to get too close to Ye-na, fearing that she will find out that her father is a former assassin. Do Hyun understands Ji-young's concern and agrees to keep his distance, but he can't help feeling regret for missing out on so many years with his daughter. The following morning, Do Hyun visits Ye-na's school to give her a watch as a gift. However, he is preoccupied with the warning Ji-young gave him the previous night, causing him to hesitate. While in deep thought, he is hit by a car, which happens to be driven by Eun-ju, the daughter of Young Min. The driver and Ye-na try to take responsibility for the accident, but Do Hyun acts as if nothing has happened and tries to avoid her. However, the driver realizes that Do Hyun is injured and bleeding. He immediately took him to the clinic for treatment. When he was there, the driver exchanged business cards with him. Later, Young Min came to the clinic to check on the victim, and the driver gave him Do Hyun's business card. Young Min was stunned to see Do Hyun's name on the card, as he recognized him as his old partner in the world of assassins. Later that night, Do Hyun and Ye-na are about to go home. As they wait for the bus, Ye-na opens up about her mother's loneliness and how she often cries at night. She expresses her wish for Do Hyun to get closer to her mother. Do Hyun remains silent and instead hands Ye-na the watch he had purchased earlier. The gift brings joy to both of them, and Do Hyun asks Ye-na for a hug, which she warmly gives. Though he feels happy at the moment, Do Hyun is weighed down by the knowledge of his true identity. Meanwhile, Young Min is shaken with fear as he imagines that Do Hyun is seeking revenge on him for the past. He can't shake off the thought of Do Hyun coming after him. The next morning, Ji-young notices Ye-na's new watch and suspects that it might be a gift from Do Hyun. Worried, Ji-young asks Ye-na to remove the watch, but Ye-na refuses, stating that Do Hyun is a kind person and she enjoys spending time with him. Hearing this, Ji-young becomes even more disheartened. Back to Young Min, who is fearful that Do Hyun is seeking revenge on him after their past in the world of assassins, and instructs his men to watch his movements. Later, Ji-young unexpectedly encounters Do Hyun at his workplace and invites him to her salon to shave and chat. During their conversation, Do Hyun reveals that Ye-na misses her father very much. Ji-young reiterates to Do Hyun that he must never disappoint Ye-na again. Later, at the car wash, Young Min's henchmen show up and start attacking Do Hyun without any explanation. Do Hyun comes out of hiding and gets brutally beaten up by the men, who inform him that Young Min ordered the attack. Do Hyun is shocked to discover that Young Min is behind the assault. After the attack on Do Hyun, Young Min's men return to the office and face Bak-sun. However, they are met with resistance and beaten back by Bak-sun. Young Min reprimands his men for their actions, as he only instructed them to keep an eye on Do Hyun, not to physically harm him. However, the men, curious about Young Min's true strength, plot to attack Do Hyun again. After the incident, Do Hyun is taken to the hospital to treat his injuries. Meanwhile, Young Min becomes increasingly anxious about the situation and orders his men to keep a close eye on Do Hyun. However, while on the way back home, Young Min instructs his men not to pursue Do Hyun any further. It seems that he is starting to realize that their actions may have serious consequences. The following day, Do Hyun returns to work, and Young Min's men continue to keep an eye on him from afar. At one point, they receive a call from Young Min, who orders them to take photos of Do Hyun's activities. The men follow his orders and manage to capture several pictures of Do Hyun in action. Later, they hand over the pictures to Young Min for further scrutiny. Meanwhile, at school, Eun-ju resumes her bullying behavior by targeting another friend, and Ye-na once again steps in to protect the victim. However, Eun-ju sees through Ye-na's heroic act and shoves her from behind, causing her head to hit a pole and start bleeding. After receiving the devastating news of Ye-na's accident, Do Hyun rushes to the hospital. Upon arrival, he is informed that Ye-na requires surgery due to a concussion. Meanwhile, Eun-ju begins to panic and realizes the severity of her actions. She calls her father to inform him about the incident. Shortly after, Young Min arrives at the school and meets with Eun-ju, who is confronted by her homeroom teacher. He threatens the teacher and urges her not to escalate the issue further. At the hospital, Do Hyun was relieved to learn that Ye-na's surgery had been successful. However, he couldn't shake the worry from his mind that she was still unconscious. The doctors informed him that there was a possibility that Ye-na had suffered from brain trauma due to the violent impact on her head. Determined to seek justice, though Hyun took the initiative to go to the police station to report the incident. However, when he arrived, the police and the general counsel on duty attempted to persuade him to reconcile instead of taking legal action. Though Hyun couldn't help but feel suspicious that something was amiss. He suspected that Young Min had bribed the officers to cover up the incident. Disappointed by the lack of justice, though Hyun left the police station and returned to the hospital to be by Ye Na's side. As though Hyun sits by Ye Na's hospital bed, hoping for her to wake up soon, he is approached by Ye Na's friend Da-hee. Da-hee has information that could be crucial to the investigation of Ye Na's accident. She tells though Hyun that she witnessed Eun-ju pushing Ye Na, causing her head to hit a pole. Upon hearing this news, though Hyun's heart races with anger and determination to get to the bottom of what happened. He rushes to contact the school to schedule a meeting with Eun-ju and her homeroom teacher. Though Hyun believes that this problem can be resolved without involving the police and causing further damage to Ye Na's already fragile state. But for some reason, the teacher is unwilling to cooperate and cover up the incident. Not giving up, though Hyun tries to meet Eun-ju after school, but he is ambushed by Young Min's men and Eun-ju is taken away. During the attack, though Hyun recognizes the assailants who had beaten him up at the car wash earlier, leading him to suspect Eun-ju's involvement with Young Min. After Young Min's men successfully pick up Eun-ju, they convince Young Min that she was almost kidnapped by though Hyun. This falsehood enraged Young Min, who assumes that though Hyun is seeking revenge by abducting Eun-ju. In a fit of anger, he orders his men to kill though Hyun that very day. All of Young Min's men go to the car wash where though Hyun works and demand to know where he lives. They threaten the owner of the car wash to get the information. Meanwhile, some of Young Min's men go to the hospital to kidnap Ji-young. Later, the rest of Young Min's men show up at though Hyun's rented house and hold him hostage. Once they have him captive, Young Min's men show though Hyun a video where Ye Na and Ji-young are being held as hostages. The video sends chills down though Hyun's spine as he watches his loved ones being held at gunpoint. Upon seeing his loved ones in danger, though Hyun is overcome with emotions, and his inner killer instinct awakens. One by one, he takes down Young Min's men with ease. When Young Min discovers this, he orders his men to kidnap Ye Na and take her to an old factory building. When though Hyun is at the hospital, he discovers that only the unconscious Ji-young is there and that his daughter Ye Na has been kidnapped by Young Min. Though Hyun then contacts Detective Choi to let him know what's happened and tells him that he's willing to become the murderer again to save his daughter. Though Hyun's plan is risky, but he is determined to save his daughter. He intercepts Eun-ju's car and beats up her bodyguards, forcing her to call Young Min. When Young Min answers, though Hyun takes over the phone and demands that he hand over Ye Na immediately if he wants to see his own daughter alive. Young Min's men arrive to pick up Eun-ju, and a fierce fight ensues. During the fight, one of Young Min's dying men reveals where Ye Na is being held hostage. Though Hyun entrusts Eun-ju to Hae-kong and heads to the factory alone. On the other hand, Detective Choi gets news of the murder of several members of Young Min's mob gang. He is stunned and didn't expect though Hyun could commit such an act. Driven by his curiosity, he starts to investigate though Hyun's whereabouts, but to no avail. One day, while Detective Choi is questioning the innkeeper where though Hyun lives, he stumbles upon a new clue that leads him to an old abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city. Though Hyun, who has arrived at the factory, is immediately greeted by Young Min, who tells him to hand over Eun-ju. Despite Young Min demanding Eun-ju in exchange for Ye Na's safety, though Hyun refused to be intimidated and insisted on getting his daughter back first. Their argument quickly escalated, and before long, Young Min's men launched an attack on though Hyun. Though badly injured and outnumbered, though Hyun refused to back down and fought back fiercely, determined to rescue his daughter. As the intense fight between though Hyun and Young Min continued, the latter saw an opportunity to attack when he realized that though Hyun was already severely injured. However, though Hyun refused to back down and continued to fight, determined to save his daughter. Despite the odds against him, though Hyun's fighting spirit remained unbroken. As the duel between the two intensified, Young Min began to be overwhelmed and begged though Hyun to give up Eun-ju. Just then, Hae-kong arrived, bringing Eun-ju with him as per though Hyun's earlier request. As Young Min saw that his daughter was unharmed, he realized that he could trust though Hyun to keep his word and release Ye Na. And finally, both sides were reconciled. Soon after, Ji-young arrives with the police and an ambulance to the factory. She was relieved to see that Ye Na was safe and rushed her to the hospital for treatment. However, though Hyun appeared to be seriously injured from the battle with Young Min's men, despite knowing that he would return to prison for his actions, though Hyun felt a sense of happiness knowing that his daughter survived. As though Hyun watched the ambulance leave with Ye Na, he began to reminisce about his past friendship with Young Min, realizing that it was destroyed by a simple misunderstanding. The moral that can be learned from this movie is that revenge and violence can lead to a vicious cycle of harm and destruction, and that forgiveness and reconciliation can be a more effective way to resolve conflicts and build lasting relationships. Additionally, the importance of family and the bond between a parent and child, and how far a person would go to protect their family,